Mr. Speaker, the Premier's flood recovery program has been very slow and rather inequitable. As an example, the road to Big Point, a community of 80 homes and 400 to 500 people each summer, has a road which is not yet passable. In almost a year, there has been no help from this government to upgrade this road and make it usable.
Many of them like that.
On the other hand, the government has spent very considerable funds on a beautifully completed road near Riverton, which leads to a single property in a spot which I'm told is not very likely to flood. I ask the Premier, when will he end the inequity and treat people fairly?
I thank the member for the question. I will take the specifics of that and look into it. The reality is we've spent $589 million in this budget on roads and bridges, and with a specific focus on repairing roads and bridges impacted by the flood. And even last year during the flood, we put extraordinary resources into the Interlake area to help build up roads after they had been flooded out and repair them to allow people to have access to their cottages and homes. The reality is we will continue to do that, Mr. Speaker, because we know roads are important as a tool of economic recovery in that area and to allow people to have access to their cottages. In addition, we built the $100 million project to lower Lake St. Martin and Lake Manitoba. That project was done in record time under emergency conditions and has brought down the lake 2.5 to 3 feet lower than it would otherwise be. Those are the kinds of extraordinary commitments that we put in place as we spent $1 billion to fight this flood, the worst in the history of the province of Manitoba.
Last May 30th, the Minister of Agriculture, now the Minister of Finance, said in reference to the support for people on Lake Manitoba, we want this money to go very quickly.
Yeah.
And yet 10 months later, the end of the fiscal year, March 31st, 2012, only approximately 20% of the money allocated to the Lake Manitoba Financial Assistance Plan had actually been spent. And critical roads, like the road to the Big Point community, are not yet rebuilt. In all my years in politics, I have never seen a program so badly mismanaged.
Incompetent.
When will the Premier act to make sure that critical roads are rebuilt so that homes and communities can be rebuilt?
Thank the member for the question. We have spent $600 million in various programs, compensation programs and infrastructure renewal programs dealing with the flood. And I've been in the Interlake and I've seen some of the roads we put in place, which not only acted as roads, but they acted as dikes as well to protect these communities in the future. These are major undertakings done in record time, and if there's a specific road that the member feels neglected, we will look into that and see what the specifics of that are and take a look at what needs to be done and what can be done as expeditiously as possible. I'm pleased the member has raised the question. We will follow up and examine the specifics.
The Premier knows it's a road into Big Point. As the Premier knows, a major contributor to the flood on Lake Manitoba was the enormous amount of water flowing through the Portage diversion. At its peak, it was half the annual volume of that going over Niagara Falls. Imagine that.
Imagine.
That also contributed, through the Portage diversion, a lot of silt and mud. And because Big Point is just north of the exit for the Portage diversion, a lot of that mud got deposited, and that's what's covered up this road and caused a lot of problems there. I'd like the Premier to acknowledge that this was a problem of the Portage diversion, the artificial flooding, and get to work 10 months after the fact, get the road working so that people can get to their homes and cottages at Big Point.
Again, I thank the member for the question. As I said in my previous question, we will look at the specifics of the issue he raised on the Big Point Road. I do want to point out that we have spent over $600 million on addressing flood issues, both infrastructure and compensation, that staff in both MAFRE, the Department of Agricultural and Rural Development, as well as the insurance agencies over there, MASC, have done an extraordinary amount of work, an extraordinary amount of overtime. Our disaster assistance people and emergency measures have done yeoman's work. I remember one individual in particular working for emergency measures that literally was living in a motel for over 40 days as he fought the flood last spring and hadn't been home during that entire period of time where he worked 7-day weeks. Our public servants have done heroic amount of work to address the flood, the worst in Manitoba history. And again, we will look into the very specific issue that the member has raised with respect to the road into Big Point and see what can be done and how fast it can be done.